Good afternoon, everybody. Good morning to those of you who are joining us from the US. My name is Amy Pope. Welcome to the Homeland Security and the Emergency Response to the Coronavirus in the United States. We are very lucky to have with us former Secretary of Homeland Security, Jeh Johnson. Jeh Johnson is currently a partner at the US law firm Paul, Weiss, Rifkin, Wharton, and Garrison. He served as the Secretary of Homeland Security under President Obama. I had the great pleasure of working with him in response to a number of pandemics. Before that, he served as General Counsel at the Department of Defense. Secretary Johnson is going to offer you a series of comments on what's happening in the US today, and particularly on the response of the US government and vis-a-vis the states and local governments. He'll offer some comments and then we'll open it up to questions. Secretary Johnson, it's a great pleasure to be here with you today, and I'm going to turn it over to you, and we'll go from there.
Good afternoon, everybody in the United Kingdom. Good morning, anyone in the United States. Amy, my former colleague in the Obama administration, it's great to talk with you again. Last time we were together, we were debate partners at the Oxford Union. We won the debate, owing principally to Amy's advocacy. I also want to give a shout out to my former DHS colleagues who are participants in this program. I saw the list. I know all the hard questions are going to come from them. I'm interested that there are no Chatham House rules at Chatham House today. So let me just spend a couple of minutes by way of introduction to describe where we are in the United States here. As of this morning, according to the Johns Hopkins website, which is what everybody looks at here in this country in terms of the data, there were 1,662,000 COVID-19 cases in the United States, and we are approaching yet another grim milestone, 100,000 deaths here in the United States as a result of COVID-19. As most of you know, I'm sure, something like 1/3 of all of the cases in the United States reside in the states of New Jersey or New York. I live in New Jersey, just outside of New York, and I work under normal circumstances in Manhattan in New York City. So where I sit, where I work, where I live is very much part of ground zero for the COVID-19 disaster here in the United States. This is clearly a once-in-a-century, unprecedented crisis, but it was not, as Amy knows, unanticipated. Ever since the lethal virus that spread across much of the world through Western Africa and some in the United States, Ebola in 2014, the possibility of a lethal virus and its spread has been very much on the minds of Homeland Security officials in the United States. This one obviously is much bigger than anything we've seen in a century, and it is truly a nationwide crisis. As I speak, the data, the trend lines here in the United States suggest that the worst is over. Particularly in New York State, the trend lines in terms of new cases, deaths, hospital occupancy are all going in the right direction. New Jersey is a bit behind New York State. Nationwide, the trend lines tend to look pretty good. We seem to have reached the top of the bell curve and we're headed in a downward direction. There are areas in our country that are spiking higher, however. Montgomery, Alabama, for example. We are seeing communities where the virus was not spreading widely before, where it is now spreading, particularly in vulnerable populations where the healthcare is poor. But the trend lines are good. What has made the difference and what I think has led to the trend lines heading in the right direction, and this has been true worldwide, until there's a vaccine, we've all had to physically distance and engage in social distancing, good hygiene, which has led to a slowing of the spread of the virus. Therefore, I have been quarantined basically in my house here in Montclair, New Jersey for the last 2 months now, and I am not allowed to go to my workplace in New York City in Manhattan. And my guess is that it'll be some time before the last phase in the reopening will take place, probably late summer, Labor Day at the earliest. We are beginning to think about reopening. And there's been a lot of misunderstanding about the roles of governments here in the United States in dealing with this crisis. And there's been misunderstanding even here in the United States. So I'm required to stay in my house, to quarantine in my house by order of the governor of New Jersey. The public health and the police power in our country resides largely at the state level. The President of the United States, the national government, does not have the legal authority to tell me to stay in my own home. Curfew power, quarantine power rest at the state level. I am not allowed to go to my place of work in New York by virtue of an order of the governor of New York. At the federal level, the principal role is, in a crisis like this, resources, surging resources, marshaling resources through legal authorities like the Defense Production Act and others, and also preserving and stimulating our economy. And Congress has done that through several acts now, but those are the principal roles at the federal level. But requiring us to physically distance is a state level authority, and it will be up to the states to determine when that is lifted. I've been asked by the governor of New Jersey to think about that for our region in the Northeast as part of a working group and as part of a New Jersey-based commission. This will occur in phases. And in almost every country, almost every state in this country now, we have slowly begun to reopen our economy. The virus has devastated our economy. The national unemployment rate is 14.7%. which is the highest it's been in decades. I read this morning that in the state of California, our largest state, the unemployment rate is 24%, which is a Depression era level of unemployment. But we have begun to reopen state by state, region by region, carefully. This will have to occur in phases where things like construction and manufacturing have gone first. The last phase will include things like white-collar businesses like law firms, investment banks, retail, restaurants. But this has been a true devastation on our economy. We have to do it slowly. Testing will be critical to reopening in phases. Contact tracing will be critical to reopening in phases, because this will not be a risk-free proposition. The virus will still be with us as we leave our homes and slowly go back to work. Much of the reopening will have to be interlocking. So to have a plan for me to return to my office in New York, you need to have a plan for public transportation. You need to have a plan for younger parents with kids who go to school, who need childcare. So it's all interrelated. And I've been advocating that in the directives to reopen our economy, our leadership at the state level make clear what businesses may do, what they must do, and what they cannot do. A lot of contact tracing, for example, implicates privacy. When you ask people, where have you been? What is your temperature? What is your health history? It invades what we typically regard as private medical matters. So we have to be careful with the way we do this, and there will be a new normal. Without a doubt, when we go back to society, to work as normal, I'm quite sure we will be engaging in a different level of hygiene, a different and better level of hygiene, and a fair amount of social distancing. There will be a new normal. Interestingly, many of us have learned that we can work almost as efficiently, if not as efficiently, virtually from our homes, practicing law, say, as we would in a workplace. But there will be a new normal when we return. Those are my opening remarks. Amy, over to you.
That's great. And I have to say that Oxford Union debate was one of the highlights of my experience here in the UK. And it was in large part due to your very excellent arguments and very good advice going into it. You may want to know that not only has Secretary Johnson debated at Oxford, he's also debated at Cambridge, and now he's a member of their debating society. So one of our own expats here in London, even if he's technically in New Jersey at the moment. So a couple of things. I mean, I worked closely with you in response to the Ebola outbreak, for example. There was clearly a role that we, as the federal government, thought we should be playing. And there's a lot of negotiation going on with states and governors, mayors, et cetera, over a range of issues. How do you see that playing out here? What's missing? What's needed? Or is it fine to, as President Trump has said, just leave it to the governors to figure their own way out?
Well, the Ebola virus and COVID are fundamentally different, both in terms of scope and how they are transmitted. Ebola, of course, emanated from 3 countries in West Africa. There were only a handful of cases that reached the United States, known cases. And there, the response was principally at the federal level, as you recall, Amy. It was mostly travel restrictions where we funneled travelers from West Africa into 5 airports in the United States, which the Secretary of Homeland Security had the authority to do. And once they arrived, they received a heightened health screening. And as you recall, once we imposed that, there was not a single case of Ebola that arrived in the United States without our knowledge. And then, of course, we supported and we led the international community in sending our military and our healthcare community to West Africa to combat the virus at the source. COVID is fundamentally different because of its scale. It's here in the United States. The United States has by far the largest number of cases. It's in virtually every corner of our country, in every state, in every community. And so the response has to be at the state level in terms of requiring physical distancing, which is what governors and mayors have the power to do. And so it's fundamentally different, but there are some lessons to be learned. One, a lethal virus can spread to indeterminate extents. It can spread to virtually every state if it is not stopped at the source. And as I learned, first responses are not always the best responses. So President Trump is very proud of the fact that on January 31st, he issued a travel restriction coming from China. Turns out that was far too late. The virus got here anyway, and it reached here in unprecedented levels, and the United States has by far the most cases, something like 30% of the entire world's cases. So there are lessons to be learned, but they are fundamentally different.
What about places where you really do need a federal response? So for example, you think about food production in the United States and the long haul trucking that transports fruits that are grown in California to the markets in New York or New Jersey, for example. What guidance should governors be given about activities that are fundamentally cross-country, cross-border?
Well, very clearly, there's a role for the federal government in a situation like this. And I'm quite sure when this is all over, there will be multiple congressional committees and IGs and scholars who will study what the federal government should have done differently. But the role at the federal level is and should have been from the beginning marshaling resources. And the Department of Homeland Security through FEMA actually does have the power to do that if it is executed properly. And so rather than, as Governor Cuomo has complained about repeatedly, states engaging in bidding wars for things like ventilators or PPE or test kits, at the federal level, we could have marshaled and allocated those things to the communities that needed them the most without the bidding war. But now it's far too late for that. Things are virtually everywhere, but we could have marshaled resources much more effectively, and FEMA should have played the central role in doing that. FEMA has the authority to do that. It's one of the things they do best. You couple FEMA with the Army Corps of Engineers and the National Guard together, and those 3 agencies, those 3 institutions of government can do and should do a very effective job in marshaling resources.
That's really interesting. I'm going to open it up for people to ask questions. You should use the raise your hand function if you have a question. Before I do that, though, the Department of Homeland Security is a fairly new agency. It was stood up really in response to the lessons from 9/11 when it was clear that we did not have connectivity across the federal government to be able to detect and respond effectively to a terrorist threat. Are there any lessons from the counterterrorism efforts within the federal government that can be applied here? Do you see any analogies, or is it just so different that you can't really apply lessons learned?
Yes, there is an analogy, actually. So I could spend another hour on this, but DHS, the Department of Homeland Security, was created in the wake of 9/11, as you said. And effectively, what Congress did was to consolidate into one cabinet level department agencies that regulate all the different ways somebody gets into our country, cross-border, land, sea, and air. And the thinking in 2002 was terrorism was something that was extraterritorial, so that if you do a better job of connecting dots and regulating all the different ways somebody can get into our country, you defeat terrorism. That model worked for a while, but then we've seen the rise of domestic-based terrorism, terrorism that is inspired through the internet by overseas organizations, but the actors are already here in the homeland. And so simply regulating our borders is no longer the answer to terrorism, particularly domestic-based terrorism. By analogy, fighting a lethal virus like this one is not simply a matter of regulating our borders, because it only takes one or two or a handful of COVID-infected people to contaminate an entire community, as we know now. And so dealing with a virus like this means regulating, requiring physical distancing here at home, and allocating resources here at home, which at the federal level, FEMA is equipped to do.
We're getting a lot of questions coming in. I'm going to start with Jennifer Fawcett. Jennifer, if you would just introduce yourself and then your affiliation before you ask your question. Thanks.
Hi, it's Jennifer Shorter Fawcett, and I'm with Customs and Border Protection.
Hello, Jennifer.
Hi, sir. What role do you see, and I apologize, I put this in the wrong section in terms of messaging, I didn't raise my hand. What role do you see travel restrictions and border restrictions in terms of pandemic response? And when do you see them as best implemented, meaning early on versus later on in terms of wider federal government pandemic response?
Early on, Jennifer. What's interesting now is we're seeing other countries, particularly in South America, imposing travel restrictions on Americans coming to their countries because we're ground zero. And even here in our country, people who come from my particular region are viewed with deep suspicion when we try to go someplace else. And so travel restrictions are effective if they are imposed early enough so that you can try to limit the spread of the virus. But once it is here, once it is embedded in our communities, time, attention, resources, funding are probably best spent dealing with the healthcare crisis, trying to contain the spread within our borders.
Sophie Zinzer, do you want to introduce yourself and your affiliation? Unmute yourself, go ahead.
Sure. Thank you so much, Amy and Secretary Johnson. My name is Sophie Zinzer. I am a Schwarzman Scholar, originally based in Beijing, now residing in Hong Kong. I'm an American, and previously I lived in the Middle East. I've been following your work for a while. Thank you so much for this lecture. It's great.
How are things in Hong Kong?
They've been better. It's been a really stressful weekend here. It's definitely escalating a lot, and I only foresee it being an even spicier summer. But yeah, we'll see. I wanted to turn my question focusing on Homeland Security in the U.S. to something you alluded to in your response to Jennifer's question previously, which is the public mental health problem, which I believe to be very grave, and danger of racism, both amid the COVID-19 outbreak and because of its after effects, focusing specifically on Asian Americans, which we saw sort of before the lockdown measures and are seeing online during, as well as the potential, as Obama alluded to recently in his graduation speech, of having people increasingly stay with their own kind, maybe after the COVID-19 outbreak. So given the fact that this might really influence the structure of American society, I guess I'm wondering, because you mentioned earlier about the responsibility of marshaling resources that the Homeland Security has, how you think resources or the government can best mobilize in an ideal situation to combat some of these potential after effects, and or if you think that they're going to be grave at all. Thank you.
Where do I start? So I think that as governors lift the restrictions on association, travel, workplaces, as I said earlier, they will need to make clear what employers, what businesses, what public accommodations may do, what they must do, and what they cannot do. And so we will need to reiterate to businesses, to educational institutions, you cannot discriminate against someone based upon their ethnic or national origin or where you think they may have traveled from based on their race. We'll need to reiterate that. I am very concerned that we will be in a new normal along the lines of what you alluded to, where people will be more comfortable in familiar circumstances. They will be suspicious of those different from themselves. We've been on a long-term trend toward increased virtual meetings, remote meetings. In my law firm, for example, when 3 people want to have a conversation, first impulse is, well, let's jump on a call. Let's jump on a conference call. And I have to remind people every once in a while, your office is 5 doors down from mine. Face-to-face meetings there's no substitute for a face-to-face meeting. A lot of us are finding that having discussions like the one we're having right now is almost as good. It's like 70% of being there. And it's also very efficient because it's just an hour of your time as opposed to an hour plus the time to get there, the time to travel to Chatham House, the time to go to the meeting in New York. But my concern is that this will encourage a new social dynamic where people want to stay sheltered in the comfort of their homes, in the comfort of familiar territory, and we'll have to be encouraged to step out of our comfort zones so that we interact again in ways that foster good business relationships and the like. And I hope that's something that our leaders will reiterate.
Thank you so much.
There's an interesting question embedded in what Sophie asked, which is perhaps relevant to the role the department plays, which is kind of the rise of extremism against different communities within the US, and particularly in the context of the role of the protesters. How would you be thinking about that problem right now if you were sitting over at DHS? We saw increasing number of protesters, increasing numbers of attacks on Asian American communities, for example. What are the key elements of the solution to something like that?
Well, if I could try to imagine myself as the Secretary of Homeland Security in the Trump administration, I think my advice to the president would be, okay, you're telling the governors it's on them. Don't complicate their lives by sending the wrong health message by not wearing a mask in public places, or by sending out a tweet saying, liberate Minnesota or liberate Michigan. To any English-speaking person, the word liberate suggests protest, demonstration, resistance, freedom fighters. So when the President of the United States, the leader of the nation, says to people, liberate a state, you're just simply complicating the lives of governors who you said have the authority to decide when it's okay to reopen their states and reopen their communities. And so that's part of the problem that we see here in this country. Fortunately, around the country, a lot of governors, like Andrew Cuomo in New York, like Mike DeWine in Ohio, Larry Hogan in Maryland, are recognized by their constituents as doing a faithful job. Their approval ratings are in the 70, 80% because they recognize that they're trying to do the best for the public interest, for public health. And so the governors have really been the ones here who've been at the front lines in terms of the political leadership to help us navigate through this problem.
Leslie, do you want to go ahead and ask a question?
Yes. First of all, thank you. I'm Leslie Vinjamori, Director of the U.S. and Americas Program here at Chatham House. It is really an honor for us to have you speak with us. We know that sometimes people assume because we're working from home, we're not busy, but we are certain that you have your hands quite full in this period in particular. So thank you. I think Amy really started with kind of where I wanted to continue, which I guess is, you laid out very clearly, and I think it is very important, especially for our international audience, that confusion of, federalism and state versus federal authority persists overseas. It persists at home. But, there is this question of formal and informal authority. And I think that's part of what Amy was getting at. And of course, the question of whether or not there is a trust at the center in the US. And it matters not only for the states and for the governors and for the people who have to follow the governors, but for those of us sitting outside of the United States, it matters because we look to America as a role model, as an example, as an exemplar, as a sign of, where things have been, where they're going, and people look for leadership, and it hasn't been forthcoming in the way that it sometimes has been in the past. I would say certainly when you were in a position of government authority. So I guess one of my questions that follows from that is, though, a domestic question, and it is, what is this doing to questions of partisanship and questions of, leaders need followers. So governors have formal authority, but they do need their people to follow them. And they're not operating in states that are 100% aligned with them in terms of their partisan affiliation. So are you seeing a change in people's alignments? I mean, some of the things that we're wondering about is, perhaps alignments are changing because older people are more vulnerable. So perhaps they're less divided amongst themselves. Younger people are suffering economically. Perhaps this is driving them together. I mean, could you illuminate for us, perhaps even just in your own state, how you see political divides changing as a result of this? Which way are the people that you are, in touch with, which way are they leaning in terms of that preference for, giving value to the economic consequences versus the health consequences? And do you imagine these changes, if, to the extent that we're seeing realignments, do you imagine them staying with us? Or is this going to be a short-term effect that goes away if and when there's a vaccination and we move forward?
So top line, if you look at the polling, Republicans, people in red states, tend to believe that we should get back to work. It's not that big a deal. I'm not quoting the exact polling question, but the polling suggests that Republicans, people in red states, tend to want to get back to life as normal, and people in blue states are more cautious and believe that we need to continue physical distancing. That is driven in part by the messaging that has come from the White House, but it's also driven by circumstance. The states most devastated by COVID-19 in this country happen to also be blue states: New York, New Jersey, California, and we're seeing now blue regions in red states that are being devastated by COVID, like Alabama, Montgomery, Alabama, which I spoke of earlier. But attitudes toward this are, in fact, breaking down on Republican versus Democratic partisan lines. And I suspect it is for both reasons. And that is obviously unfortunate because a healthcare crisis and the appropriate health response shouldn't depend upon party affiliation, and shouldn't depend upon what region of the country you are. Clearly, there is no one-size-fits-all solution to when we reopen our economy in this big, diverse country. The answer for where I reside here in northern New Jersey in Essex County is different than the answer for Wyoming or North Dakota for the cattle ranchers in North Dakota. Clearly, the answer is different. When we reopen, how we reopen is different in the Northwest than it is in the Northeast because of population density, demographics, the economies, the nature of the workforce. But that shouldn't break down on political lines. But so many things now are doing exactly that in this country. You know, how you define high crimes and misdemeanors, for example, breaks down along partisan lines. And I think what is happening, and I've heard a pollster say this and it rings true, in this country, because Americans are so deeply divided and their views about Donald Trump are so deeply entrenched, anytime they are being polled on a question that sounds to them like a pro or anti-Trump question, they're going to answer it in accordance with their views of Donald Trump. So, you know, if you ask the voter, do you think we should build more border wall on the southern border? They will recognize that as a question about Donald Trump's agenda. And they will answer according to whether or not they are pro or anti-Trump, irrespective of the merits of the question being asked. And that's why, you know, incredibly, his approval ratings through the impeachment trial, through COVID, have essentially remained the same because people's views are so entrenched. So I'm essentially agreeing with the premise of your question.
I have Fareed Nemri next. Fareed, do you want to unmute yourself and identify your affiliation?
Thank you so much. My name is Fareed, and I'm a Schwarzman Scholar this year, and I'm an American citizen currently residing in Jordan, in the Middle East. We mentioned the establishment of Homeland Security in the aftermath of 9/11. Another big reform or new establishment in the federal government was also the DNI to gather and collect and inform the president of better intelligence in a more effective way. Many would argue that this pandemic has highlighted also some flaws and shortcomings in the federal government to deal with intelligence on public health, maybe in an effective manner. Do you think, Secretary Johnson, that there will be some kind of big high-level reform in science, innovation, intelligence, and otherwise related to public health and to dealing with public health crises? Thank you so much in advance.
I think that question is worthy of study. Right now, trying to answer it, it would be a little like trying to assess what happened on 9/11, on 9/12. We're still in the midst of this crisis, and I believe that your question is worthy of a long-term study. My initial take, sitting here now, is that the problem is that there's no systemic problem within our intelligence community. My personal experience with the intelligence community under the DNI structure, which I was initially not a fan of, but I am now, is that at least when Jim Clapper was the DNI, it worked pretty well. You had a whole bunch of intelligence agencies in the alphabet soup that would give us, the consumers in government, their products, And if you had a question about it, you could always probe deeper with the analysts, but it was working pretty well. And there are public reports that our nation's leaders were warned about this coming pandemic, but that they did not act soon enough in response to it, or adequately enough, or aggressively enough in response to what they were being told. So I don't know, sitting here right now, that there's any institutional problem with the way our intelligence community is structured around a public health crisis that needs to be addressed, but I think we all should have an open mind about that.
I have Emery Sayer. Do you want to unmute yourself?
Amy, how would you answer that question?
Look, I think that it's not a question necessarily of the bureaucracy, but with the one exception of, I think the lesson learned from our time was that the public health community doesn't necessarily respond in the same tempo and with the same sense of coordination as we found either the military or FEMA. And so it's not a question of getting the intelligence up there, but there's something to be said for bringing the strengths of the other parts of the bureaucratic structure to bear in a public health response. And we tried to do that. We put together both a pandemic playbook as well as a presidential, it's not the same thing as an executive order, but it's a level down, but that basically created a bureaucratic structure. And we asked Congress for additional money to help respond, because the one thing FEMA has, as those of you, Secretary of course knows, and those of you on the call who are familiar with FEMA, they have a very significant amount of funding that they can draw upon so that they can react very, very quickly. And there is the beginnings of that within the US government right now, but it's not enough. So we don't have the quick response that you'd have in a response to a terrorist attack, even if the information and the intelligence is coming in. And that's where I think there's room to grow in the health world.
I agree with that.
Emery, do you want to unmute yourself and ask the question?
Hello, this is Emre Sayar. Actually, I'm a businessman and entrepreneur, and I'm actually making an executive MBA in a Triumph. That's why I have connected to this panel, and I'm a Turkish citizen. I'm based in Turkey. We are currently in a lockdown, and we are getting better in the virus. And my question is, what coming to my mind, is if one person is spread the virus to millions, like in a couple of weeks or let's say a couple of months. So how we will control the virus when we open the economies back to normal with only social distancing? Is that a possibility? Or, American economy, President Trump is insisting that it should open very, very quickly and very, very soon. And they're already opening the, let's say, economy. And so without vaccine, do you think the economy can operate? And let's say, like emerging country that we are living in Middle East, which we cannot print dollars, how the world will look to us is also a question mark to me. And I see a big problem without the vaccine is available. So I'd like to get your thoughts on this. Thank you so much.
Excellent question. So the question essentially highlights why reopening is so difficult, because the virus will not have disappeared. The virus will still be present among us. We will reopen in phases carefully, and when we go back to, say, our workplaces, there will be protocols, there should be protocols for keeping your distance. A lot of people, by the way, don't like to call it social distancing. They like to call it physical distancing, because you can still engage in social interaction at a distance, like we are doing right now, for example. So, but there will be protocols for physical distancing, for good hygiene, for wearing masks, wearing gloves in common areas, constant cleaning, sanitation, and perhaps most important, testing, much more testing than we had when we went into this crisis in February, March, and contact tracing, so that if there is an outbreak, say at a particular meat packing facility or a particular office space, we can identify the outbreak and isolate it and limit its spread so that we will be much smarter about bringing people together, and we will do so in a way that promotes better hygiene. But the virus will not have gone away. But hopefully with the lessons learned, we can limit the spread in that way.
Marianne, you've been waiting a long time. Do you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Definitely. My name is Marianne Petzinger. I'm a senior research fellow with the US and Americas program at Chatham House. Thank you so much for this excellent discussion. My question has to do with that the focus right now is rightly on fighting COVID-19, but Secretary Johnson, do you see that there is a risk potentially that this crowds out preparedness for another disaster? You know, hurricane season is just to get started. And if there is that risk, what do you think the Department of Homeland Security or other departments and agencies can do to not lose sight of other potential risks?
At the Department of Defense, at least when I was there as general counsel, DOD used to say we have to be able to fight two major wars at once. We have to be in a position to fight two major wars at once. And I would have said 5 years ago that the Department of Homeland Security is equipped to deal with two major disasters at once. And during a hurricane season, you might be dealing with two natural disasters or three or four across our country at once. This is a nationwide disaster. It reaches every part of the country, and it is sapping our resources. I'm sure it is sapping the resources of the Department of Homeland Security in ways that I cannot fathom. So I am worried that we may be at risk as we go into hurricane season of a large national disaster that DHS is not adequately equipped to address quickly. And I'm worried that in a disaster situation, that may compromise our ability to limit the spread of the virus as well. I read a report the other day that, and this virus can cause a funding crisis in unanticipated ways. So for example, as some of you may know, USCIS, Citizenship and Immigration Services, is part of DHS. It's an agency within DHS, and it is almost entirely self-funded through fees, naturalization fees, fees for other applications for immigration status and the like. And USCIS is running out of money because it is not collecting fees for things like naturalizations. And so this crisis is sapping resources, and it is causing this type of crisis. And so it's fires on multiple fronts simply as a result of the crisis. And so this is a time when I hope that component leaders within DHS who are not consumed by the virus are taking care to keep their guard up when it comes to other things like a cyber attack, a border crisis, a border public health crisis, a hurricane, a tornado, and the like.
Thank you, Secretary. I have Gentry Lane next. Gentry, if you want to unmute yourself.
Yeah, hi, thank you. So quick question, because you mentioned earlier that you looked to Johns Hopkins for your most recent data, and that was interesting. I do the same thing. Shouldn't we be looking to a government source? My question was, what role does the government, or specifically DHS, have in restoring public trust in critical information, like regarding to health and safety? Is this even their job anymore?
That's a very good question. Everybody in this country, and it may be true in others, is looking to the Johns Hopkins COVID Resource Center for their data. All the news organizations are looking at Johns Hopkins. I look at Johns Hopkins. Second thing I look at is the CDC data. And the CDC data is always, at least on my computer, a day or two old. In Johns Hopkins, the data is maybe 15 minutes old, and it's continually updated. So that is the source for the international and national data, and then I look at a bunch of other sources for state by state, county by county, city by city. But you're right, there ought to be in CDC and HHS somewhere in our federal government a data source so that we're all working from a common set of facts, a common language, but there isn't really. And your question goes to the larger problem of an erosion of trust in our federal government. People like to cite that in the 1950s, over 70% of the American public trusted their government to do the right thing. And now it's down to the 20s and 30s. And when I was in government, we lamented these polling numbers. But what was interesting about those numbers, at least 4, 5, 6 years ago, is, and Amy might know this, if you look at it mission by mission by mission, faith in the government's ability at disaster response, FEMA, was still very high. It was still up in the 60, 70 percentile. I attribute that largely to the leadership of Craig Fugate and how he brought FEMA back from the days of Katrina in 2005. But at least 4 or 5 years ago, public confidence in the US government's disaster response capabilities was high. I don't know what it would look like today. I suspect it would be very different.
I have next Tom Warwick on my list. Go ahead, Tom. Do you want to identify yourself, your affiliation?
Tom Warwick, former DHS counterterrorism expert.
Yes, indeed. Well, today we're pressed into service in every way possible. Secretary Johnson, thank you very much for doing this, and Amy, thanks for hosting. Secretary, in light of what you said about the political polarization of the response to COVID-19, I'm interested in your view as to whether you see value in a Secretary of DHS in his or her public messaging, making a conscious effort to try to stay above partisan politics when communicating to the American people.
Wait, you're preaching to the choir there, Tom. You're preaching to the preacher, in fact. My answer is yes. DHS should be, but it's not, viewed as a bipartisan, apolitical, cabinet-level department. As you know, it's been consumed by this administration's immigration agenda, and it's become polarized. It's become very partisan. There are even calls to abolish DHS altogether. I do believe that the Secretary of Homeland Security should be seen as above partisan politics. I'm afraid that is not true in this administration, and I suspect he would not be allowed to even try in this administration. When I was in office, as you know, I tried to stay above the partisan fray. I appeared on, all networks, MSNBC to Fox. I still do, even now. I'm going to be on Fox in a couple of hours. Homeland Security, public health, response to natural disasters, cybersecurity, aviation security, border security really should be regarded as nonpartisan, apolitical issues. It's the safety and security of the American people, border security, maritime security, aviation security, and it's regrettable that it's simply not seen that way anymore.
Peter Vincent, also former DHS. Do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Thank you, Amy. Long-time listener, first-time caller. Mr. Secretary, this is just a fantastic and, as expected, very thoughtful conversation. So thanks to you and Amy and Chatham House for putting it together. My question follows along what Gentry and Tom have already asked, but I wanted to see if you could just spell out a bit more how you would, going forward, try to restore trust in government service, public service generally. For the past 2 to 3 years now, we've heard this disingenuous argument of a so-called nefarious deep state those of us that have been honored and privileged to work in government service know that the vast majority of government employees are nonpartisan, non-political folks that are working very, very hard. And we're going at some stage to have to get through this. How would you try to instill not just public confidence in the great work that government workers do, but a sense of pride in government workers, having gone through this past few years of being bashed about the head and shoulders day and night by the current occupant of the White House, as well as certain media outlets?
An exemplar of the type of person you just referred to, an outstanding public servant, is someone I gave a tribute to in Lawfare. Those of you listening should take a look at something I wrote for Lawfare on Friday about a gentleman by the name of Chuck Allen, who on Friday celebrated his 20th anniversary as Deputy General Counsel of the Department of Defense for International Affairs. Chuck is an SES level bureaucrat. He is among the finest public servants I know. He's been at the heart of every major national security legal issue involving the military for the last 20 years, Iraq War, Syria, Al-Qaeda, Afghanistan, military commissions, Guantanamo, you name it, Chuck's been in the thick of it. And I have no idea what Chuck Allen's politics are. He is somebody who understands that his role is to advise and support the administration in power, wherever that may be. He's been doing it for 20 years, working long hours. And to me, he's a fine example of the type of people we rely upon to run our U.S. government day to day. Regrettably, over the last 3 years, we have seen our government, institution by institution by institution, degraded, discredited, demoralized. The intelligence community, DHS, the FBI, even the Weather Service has been to a degree politicized now. And that has real consequences. So for example, you know, if there's a prosecution in federal court and the FBI is the lead agency and you're picking a jury, some jurors may have skepticism about the credibility of the FBI because it's been under such constant attack over the last 3 years. And so the ability of the FBI to do its work effectively is being compromised. The best and most honest answer I can give you is political change. Voters have the opportunity every 4 years in this country, if they don't like what's happening, to make a change. And I have been a believer in federal service my entire adult life. My mother is a native Washingtonian. My mother's still alive. She's 87. She grew up in Washington, D.C., and all of my mother's relatives were postal workers. They looked to and they believed in the federal bureaucracy as a source of long-term stability, job stability, and security. They were patriots living in the nation's capital. They revered Franklin Roosevelt, and that's in my DNA. And so I'm a big believer in federal service and appreciate the role of people who work day to day in our government. And it's up to the political leadership in power to signal that to the American public at large and not attack their own bureaucracy. And so I think the tone starts at the top, obviously.
Secretary, one last question before we wrap up. This is coming from Leslie. As COVID continues, how worried are you that there will be opportunistic bad actors with ill will toward the United States taking advantage? You can think of terrorist attacks, cyber attacks, nation states who are looking for opportunities to destabilize the country. What do you predict?
I think that is happening already. If you believe the public reports of cyber intrusions, cyber attacks to spread disinformation, sow discord, I believe it is happening now. I believe that cyber attacks, cyber theft, cyber fraud is happening now with all of the money, the billions and billions flying out of the federal treasury. I think we're seeing a rise in attempts at cyber scams online, people taking advantage of those who are desperate, with a 14.7% unemployment rate and our economy on the verge of collapse. So I think that's happening right now. We can't deny that.
Yeah. Do you have any closing remarks you want to offer before we wrap up here?
Thanks everybody for your interest. This is obviously an important topic. I believe we will get through this. I think the key, whether you're in the United States or the United Kingdom, Turkey, or any place else, is to remain disciplined. We're all getting impatient, particularly as the weather gets warmer in certain parts of the world. We want to break out. We think, what's the big deal? I don't really need to wear a mask all the time. I can let down my guard. This is contained. That is the exact wrong answer. We are still in the thick of this crisis. The trend lines are all good, but if you view it as a particular point in time, a flashpoint, we are where we were in perhaps late February, early March. And that was a dangerous time in terms of the potential for the spread of the virus. And so it's incumbent upon all of us to continue to follow the guidance of our governors, our mayors, our leaders, who have our public interest, public health at heart. And if we stay disciplined, we stay focused, we don't get sloppy, we don't let our guard down, we will get through this.
Thank you, Secretary Johnson, for your leadership, for your public service, and for your continued writing and speaking about this and other incredibly important topics. It's such a pleasure to host you today, and thanks to all of you who were able to attend and contribute to the conversation. Take care.
Thank you.
Good to see everybody again.